Okay, great. So, yes, I would like to tell you tonight about research that we've been performing in the past 5 to 10 years, trying to understand what's special about this brain, the human brain, whether it is in an adult or in fact in an infant. The human brain has extraordinarily superior capacities to learn and to abstract from what it has learned compared to, let's say, its non-human primate relatives, like the macaque brain here. And tonight I would like to tell you about inquiries into the mathematical brain. What's special that allows us to acquire mathematics? I am so impressed by what humanity has been producing. 20,000 years ago, approximately, people entered the Lascaux cave and they made these beautiful paintings of animals, which are also, in a certain sense, geometrical. You see, they abstracted away from the shape of the animal, but they also make perfectly abstract shapes like this rectangle or these lines of dots. And we see this all over the world in all sorts of cultures, spirals, circles of stone. Notice that the circle here is only abstract. You can only see it from above. So the people who built it must have had the idea of a circle before they built it without ever seeing the result as an actual circle. This capacity for geometrical symbols is extremely ancient. We see, for instance, this piece of ochre, one of the oldest from Homo sapiens from South Africa. And you see this network of parallel lines forming equilateral triangles, which undoubtedly is geometrical in nature. But there is already a zigzag 540,000 years ago from Homo erectus. It's not even sapiens. And we might debate whether these bifaces that have two planes of symmetries are spheroids, which can be as ancient as almost 2 million years ago, already betray a sense of symmetry and geometry. And yet, we also find that the sense of geometry explodes in its diversity in recent human cultures. We see, for instance, here in the Chartres Cathedral, all this diversity of geometrical shapes and how they can be combined in sort of graphic language. And yet, at the same time, there is a very frequent cross-cultural convergence towards the same basic shapes. For instance, the shape of the maze is a very familiar thing across cultures. And we see it, of course, in ancient Greece with the Minotaur. We see it in the Chartres Cathedral. In fact, almost the same exact maze is found in the Dolomites in the north of Italy in Paleolithic cultures or prehistoric cultures. So there is something to explain here. Why do we have this propensity for geometry and how can we explain it? And I will be using geometry as one example of what I think is the real secret of the human species, the ability to develop symbols and languages. We have this capacity to combine symbols together to form intricate sentences, phrases that express concepts in written and spoken communication, but also mathematical concepts, and in some cases just expressions of syntax in music. And this is also very, very ancient. There was a culture of flutes 32,000 years ago in the middle of Europe. So today we'll concentrate on mathematics, but bear in mind that the idea is that this is an illustration of something very peculiar and perhaps unique to the human mind, and we'll be testing that by comparing with monkeys, the ability to assign symbols and combine them to form languages. And I claim that this is the heart of mathematics. So this is the plan of my talk. I'll be talking about the language of geometry, the ability to combine concepts of geometry, which we see, of course, in the seminal work by Euclides. I will start by asking, why is geometry a human universal? By showing that there are precursors in non-human primates. There is proto-mathematical competence in people with reduced access to education. So there is a starting platform of proto-mathematical concepts. But my claim will be that we recycle these concepts and we recombine them together in order to create higher mathematics. And I will illustrate that in the domain of geometrical sequences, with some brain imaging evidence for where in the brain this is taking place. And also I will be telling you about geometrical shapes and why even the mere perception of a square is already enough to say, well, there is something unique about the human brain here. So I will try to claim that even shape perception, the perception of a square or rectangle or parallelogram, requires the postulation of a language of thought. So I'll start with the foundation. This is Molly was kind enough to mention my first book, The Number Sense, which appeared almost 30 years ago now, but there's a new edition. The idea is that there are very ancient non-linguistic foundations to mathematics. And number is one of them. There is core knowledge of number, but there's also a sense of space, a sense of shape that we share with many, many animal species. And that therefore is a sort of common foundation that we extracted from evolution. Basically, we evolved in a world in which it's useful to have concepts of number and space. So in the case of number, we have exquisite data already from a few years ago. For instance, the work of Andreas Nieder shows that in the monkey brain, you will find neurons that care about number. And you can see some of these neurons on the right. You find some neurons that prefer to see one item on the screen, some neurons that prefer to see two, some neurons that prefer to see 3 or 4 or 5. And this means that there is already a pretty abstract sense of numerosity, the approximate number of a set of objects in non-human primates. And we share the same representation. I'm showing you old data here, but there is even more recent data suggesting that very much in the same region, which is inside the parietal lobe, so somewhere here in both hemispheres, non-human primates as well as humans have a representation of approximate number. When we see a set of objects, we know how many items there are, and there's a little map in the parietal cortex with number 1, number 2, number 3, occupying slightly different neural populations. It's not just evidence from comparison of human and non-human primates. It's also what happens when you don't have formal mathematical education. For many years, my team, together with Pierre Picard and Elisabeth Spelke and Véronique Iza, we've been studying people from the Amazon, like these Munduruku people. And the Munduruku are interesting because they don't have formal education in mathematics, and they have not even invented counting. So they have a restricted lexicon of number words. You can see here that they have a word for 1, which they use when there is 1 object. They have a word for 2, which they use when there is 2 objects, a word for 3, a word for 4. But when there is more than 4 objects, you see that the curve collapses and they begin to use the word for 1 hand or 1 handful. They have words for few and for many. That's about it. They don't count, they don't recite these words, they don't have formal arithmetic. And yet when we tested them, we were able to show in many different tests that they're able to compute with these approximate numbers. Even for numbers that are much larger than the one for which they have names, they can still decide whether the sum of 2 sets is smaller or larger than another set. And so they understand intuitively the concepts of combining sets, the approximate numerosity that it makes, and the ability to compare with another item. They don't have exact calculations, so they fail in a task where you see 5 dots, 4 come out, and they have to decide that there's only 1 left in the box. They cannot do that exactly, but they can do that approximately. So approximation and number sense are one of the foundations that are present even in the absence of formal education. We also studied a lot the sense of geometry, the topic of my talk today, and I just want to state very briefly that essentially all of the basics of geometry can be found in these people. We test that with very simple displays where, for instance, all of the items are squares and one of them is a non-square. It's a rectangle. And you have to spot the intruder. So you can see all of these intruder displays here. Each one is tested just once. And yet the people do way better than chance on any of them, suggesting that they have concepts of parallel lines, equal sides, right angles, that they're able to bring to this task, even though it's a completely novel task for them. So foundations of number and space are present in animals. They are present in us humans because we inherit from evolution these basic concepts. Now, how do we do formal mathematics with that? This is the idea of neuronal recycling, which I've been proposing and I try to flesh out in my experiments. It's illustrated by this sort of joke or caricature here, Darwin on the body of a monkey. But there is a certain truth to that. What happens with our education in humans is that we repurpose or recycle the pre-organized neural circuits that we inherit from our evolution. So our brain contains ancient circuits, but the ability to learn is in part the ability to repurpose or recycle these circuits, to reorient them. And whenever there is a cultural invention, such as reading or number, it means that there is, in fact, a neuronal niche in the brain. There's a circuit that is close enough to the function and plastic enough that it can be reconverted. So again, the prime example of that is symbolic arithmetic. I could give a whole other talk on how we learn to read, and again, we recycle brain areas, but let's concentrate on mathematics and arithmetic. Suppose you do a very simple calculation with number symbols, something that the Munduruku could not do, like 5 minus 4, 13 minus 4. Well, when you do that, you still use the same circuits or very similar circuits to those of the monkey brain. And you only access these circuits with symbols. And the symbols allow you to have much more precise thoughts. And the symbols also allow you to combine items together to think thoughts like 10 plus 3, 13. So concepts are being refined by the symbols, and also they are being combined together. So I claim that this is really what's happening with mathematics. We start with this foundation, but we somehow build a whole pyramid of new concepts by recombining through symbolic thought and language the original ones. So there was a very simple prediction of this idea, and this is the first experiment from the lab I would like to show you, is that even if we were able to scan professional mathematicians, maybe there are some in the audience today, we would still find the same sort of circuits. They would have been recycled for very high-level mathematical thinking. So this is what we did with Maria Malric a few years ago. We managed to convince 15 professional mathematicians of pretty high standing to come to Neurospin and be scanned in fMRI while they were doing some high-level mathematics. One difficulty, and I say that a little bit in joking, is what is the control for a professional mathematician, right? In the end, we decided also to scan professors of humanities without mathematics, but of so-called matched academic standing. It's not clear what this means, except that they were all professors and they all had roughly the same salaries. But it's a comparison of people who know mathematics versus people who don't know much mathematics. Now, the other question is, what task do you make them do in the scanner? We had them listen to a sentence and decide whether the sentence was true or false. And some of the sentences bore on mathematics, and some were about facts of general knowledge about the world or historical knowledge. So I'm going to test you now. I hope you can hear my sentences and see if you think this is true or false. Oops.
There is no non-vanishing continuous tangent vector field on even-dimensional spheres.
So true or false? It's not easy, right? Because this is really meant for professional mathematicians. Notice that there is no mention of number. It's all about very abstract concepts. This sentence is actually true. It's about how a sphere cannot be fully covered by a continuous field. It's like combing a hair is impossible if it's a perfect sphere.
Any square matrix is equivalent to a permutation matrix.
True or false? This is a little bit easier. It's actually false. But you see the difficulty, right? And so we have mathematicians thinking about it. All we're asking them is for an intuitive judgment of true or false. And they were about 75% correct. We also had some control statements. So here's one.
In ancient Greece, a citizen who couldn't pay his debt was made a slave.
So here you have to bring together all of your knowledge of Greece, of slavery, history, and maybe you decide this is true. It actually seems to be true. Okay. We don't care so much about the truth or falsehood. We care about your thinking and whether you're activating the same areas for these different activities. We also had the subjects calculate, and we also presented them all of these pictures. And you see that some of these pictures include numbers or equations. So we were interested in what activates in the brain when they see this. I will not present you the full result, but just one striking result. There is a network in the brain that activates when you listen and judge mathematical sentences, which will not activate if you think about other things than math, such as history, for instance, the ancient Greece. So you see this network in colors here in the brain. Just to get you oriented, this is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain seen from the side. The eyes would be around here. So this is the parietal cortex. On both sides, you can see that both sides here, the temporal cortex and the frontal cortex in specific regions. And you can see, during the statement, there's not much activity. And suddenly at the end, when you begin to judge it, there's a huge amount of activity arising for all of the sentences that speak about math. And there is no such activation for the sentences that don't speak about math. And it's not just one directional network that would activate for effort, because there is also the converse network. So the one I showed you is in blue here on this slide. This is the mass network in blue, or mass responsive network. But conversely, the sentences that speak about general semantic knowledge activated the network in green, which is much more familiar to brain images. It's so-called semantic network that you activate when you think about the meanings of words and sentences. It involves the anterior temporal region and posterior temporal regions here and some frontal midline activity. So you see this double dissociation. We really do not activate the same network when we think about math and when we think about something else. And it's very clearly due to mass education. So here we have people listening to the same statements. The mathematicians show this very clear activation to math, but the control subjects do not, and they remain essentially agnostic about this stimuli. So what is this network? Here I'm showing you in yellow this network, which is also shown in orange on the left and right of the slide. This is what happens when professional mathematicians do high-level mathematics. But it would be wrong to think that they are the only ones to have this network. We all have this network. We all have a mass network. In fact, it's the same that would be activated in all of us if we were doing recognition of numbers, just flashing of numbers on the screen, or if we are doing mental arithmetic, like 5 minus 4. In all of these situations, you see the same sort of network lighting up. And so the yellow network here is the intersection. So in a sense, this is exactly compatible with this idea of recycling. When we do high-level mathematics, we reactivate a network that we all possess and probably possess right from the start, maybe right when we are babies, which deals initially with number and with geometry, and then gets more and more refined and abstract as we learn higher mathematics. And very importantly, it's not the same network as spoken or written language. On this slide, you see one slice through the left hemisphere. So we see very clearly the very classical brain network for language. I think many of you know that the left hemisphere in most of us is interested in language. And also this is Broca's area in the frontal lobe, and this is the temporal regions that are extended for language processing. But you see how different the mass network is. This mass responsive network, even though math is a language, is really occupying a very different set of sites in the brain. So that's one thing to remember from this talk, is when we do mathematics, we really activate a mental language, which is not the same as classical natural language. So maybe I'll skip this one in the interest of time. What we wanted to do next in the lab was really to try to narrow it down to what is the basics of this language of mathematics? Can we show how the sense of geometry emerges from the capacity to combine basic concepts? And instead of going further higher up to a higher level mathematics, we were trying to find tasks that even a preschooler could run, and that would show that, in fact, these networks are already getting organized in the form of a language of mathematics. So we came up with this task. You see here the very display that we showed to preschoolers and to first graders, and where there is 8 possible locations. You see that they are organized in a sort of octagon on a circle. And we ask a very, very simple task. You're going to see a little fish hiding in all of these ponds. Can you guess where the fish is going to go next? It's going to move around. Can you guess where it's going to go? So let me test you now with one trial. Okay, I hope you saw these 5 locations. And the question is, do you know where it's going to go next? And it's a trick question. Everybody knows. It's going to go here. It's going to go here. It's going to go here. Now, what did you do? you did something incredibly abstract. I mean, this is really one half of a trial learning, right? You didn't get the full trial, but you were already able to anticipate because you noticed the regularity of the sequence. And so this is what this test is about. It's about finding that even preschoolers, and we also tested uneducated people, again, from the Amazon and also from Namibia, we all have the idea of structures, geometrical structures, that we immediately perceive in this sort of situation. And it's not trivial. So this is the zigzag that I was just showing you. How should we understand the zigzag? Well, you need a sense of symmetry along an axis, such as the vertical axis, so horizontal symmetry, if you like. And you also need the idea that you start again the same symmetry from different starting points. So we did a lot of studies of this situation with many different sequences that you see on the top right here. And we decided that on the basis of experimental data, that the only way to account for what humans are doing here is to assume that there are in fact a little program in the head. The program for the zigzag is something like, I need to repeat 4 times that I will repeat twice the symmetry operation while I change the starting point by 1. And this is my zigzag. So when we see a zigzag on a shell in Java from 500,000 years ago, well, we are right to think that there is something very special and very unique to humans about here. It's already the trace of a language. So I will not burden you with all of the proof that we have that there is something true about this idea of a mental language. Basically, we did behavior, we did functional MRI to look at the brain circuits. We used another technique called MEG, magnetoencephalography, to look at the parsing of the sequence. And all of these data converges to say, well, the complexity of the mental language predicts the complexity of the memory on the part of the subject. Can they memorize the sequence? Or of the anticipation? What you see here is the amount of anticipations that subjects could make of the next points. And this anticipation index reflects the complexity of the underlying sequence. How easy is it to encode in this language? If I go back one slide, perhaps, we had this irregular sequence here. Why is it irregular? Because there is no way to compress it and to encode it in this language of thought. So the key idea here is that if your brain can compress it in the form of this internal language, you can memorize it and predict the next. If you can't, then you are going to be stuck. And because these are 8 items, it's too large. It's exceeding your working memory, so you will not be able to remember it. And in fMRI, we found that the same sort of parieto-frontal dorsal network that we found for mathematics is already activated by these geometrical sequences. So when you see a geometrical sequence, when you understand a zigzag, you're already performing a sort of minimal mathematical operation, which involves combining concepts in your heads, having a little formula, a sort of mental program with 4 loops that allows you to encode this basic idea of the zigzag. It's the same for 2 arcs or for 2 squares or diagonals. All of these concepts can be combined together into this elementary language. One very important thing, again, this language, even though it's a real language of geometry, does not overlap with natural language. So in red, you see the areas that are being activated when you listen to speech or when you read a story or read a sentence, and they do not overlap with the areas in yellow that are activated by this language of geometry. If, however, we ask whether there is overlap between geometry and calculation, yes, it's a huge overlap. It's very much the same areas. We need to continue this study to see whether it's exactly the same neural circuits, but by and large, it's the same overlapping areas. And can I prove that this is really something peculiar to humans? Do monkeys have the same sort of abilities? What's wonderful about this geometrical task is that it's easy enough for the rudiments of it to be taught to a monkey. So here is in the lab of Liping Wang in Shanghai, my collaborator, monkey performing something similar to what you just saw. He's reproducing a sequence. And in fact, in this particular example, he's even reproducing the sequence backwards. So on each trial, I hope you can see that there are 3 locations that are being stimulated, and the monkey is very quickly touching the screen in the opposite order. This is now a length 4 trial. Even for length 4, this particular monkey was able to do it. Most trials were correct. I hope you can see that tac, tac, tac. He is touching in the opposite order. So this is nice because the monkey is able to do the basics of the task. He's able to remember a spatial sequence and he's able to reproduce it from memory. So we can test the monkey's memory for sequences and whether it's similar to humans. But the answer is that it's very different. First of all, as you can see, these sequences are much shorter than what we tested in humans. We could not go beyond 4 with monkeys. We could go all the way to 8 or more in humans because humans have this ability to pick up the regularities, which monkey did not seem to do. Monkeys were much slower. It took tens of thousands of trials before they could do this thing that I told you a preschooler could do in just a few trials, just one trial. And there is no evidence that they can learn very complex grammars or geometrical structures. Maybe I'll go quickly with that, but it seems obvious to you that all of these patterns on the top actually belong to the same pattern. There's turning around the circle of locations. This is one of the simplest possible sequences for humans because it just involves going around the circle. It does not matter whether you start here or there, whether you turn clockwise or counterclockwise. We all treat this as the same. And likewise, there are many, each time there are 12 patterns, there are 12 instances for a particular pattern in geometry. But what we found was that monkeys have enormous variability within these patterns. So for them, it's not at all the same, all of these 12 sequences. Some are easy and some are hard, and there's this enormous variability. Whereas for humans, it's exactly the opposite. There is variability across the different patterns. And if you see this diagram here, we've sorted the 30 possible patterns that you can make out of these sequences of 4. And you can see that both for adults and for children, for instance, this sequence of going around the circle is the easiest. And there is a reproducible ordering or partially reproducible ordering of which sequences are easy and which are hard. Monkeys could not care less. Monkeys have no idea of the geometrical structures in this task. They remember the 4 locations. They seem to have slots for remembering each of these 4 locations, but they don't create a notion of structures. And they don't care whether it's a simple structure or a more complex structure, like crossing of these items and so on. So this completely flat curve here for the monkeys suggests that they really do not pay attention to the transitions and to the geometrical organization of the patterns. And I'll come back to that with more evidence a bit later. But so remember, humans seem to have a language of geometry, monkeys don't. You've all recognized very famous piece of music. The prelude in C major to the well-tempered clavier by Bach. Why am I showing you this? Because one of the questions we wanted to ask is whether the same sort of language could explain musical structures. Just a glance at this sheet of music shows that music is a sort of geometrical tapestry over time and frequency, not so much over space. But you can see in the partition these structures that you can hear in the prelude. They're almost like a zigzag, right? I hope you can see these zigzags. This is the writing by Bach himself. So we wondered whether we could have the same exact language explain some sort of musical sequences. Now, I'm sorry to say that we did not really study real music, but we studied, again, abstract sequences that are a little bit like music. So I hope that Bach will forgive me, but these are the stimuli that we had our subject listen. See if you can remember, if you have a feeling that you could remember this sequence or reproduce it. Could you remember it? It's a 16-item sequence. So it's 16 is way beyond your normal working memory. But you can remember it more or less because there is structure. Listen to this one. I bet you could repeat it. Now, how about this one? You feel overwhelmed, right? This is because here there is no structure whatsoever. It's like my most irregular geometrical sequence. I'll play it again, see if you can remember it. So these are all of these sequences that you've seen, and basically we have the same sense of regularity based on the very same sort of language for geometry. And I'll cut a long story short, but we found that the very same language that accounts for our memory for visual spatial sequences without any change can predict the subjective and also the objective complexity of a binary auditory sequence. So for instance, what you've heard when it was this sequence, it's essentially, again, a set of nested loops in a sort of language of thought, similar to a computer language. It says there's a first pair, and then it repeats with the other sound, and then there's an alternation of 4, and then the whole thing repeats. You need tree structures to explain these things. You need nestings. You need a language with a sort of grammar, a bit similar to what Chomsky has been proposing for natural language, with tree structures inside tree structures in a recursive manner. But the interesting point is that it's the same sort of grammar that we have for this sort of elementary music and for the sense of geometry that I was showing you in the spatial sequences before. We found that the same sort of brain structures are activated, especially in the parietal region, in the intraparietal sulcus again. Of course, in one case, it's vision. In the other case, it's auditory. So we do find differences in the initial sensory input. But at the abstract level, it's very likely that they are very similar structures. And this, of course, raises the very interesting question of whether mathematicians share some abstract structures with musicians, whether you can transfer from one to the other. Maybe we can address that in the discussion period. In the last part of my talk, I just want to tell you that we are also trying to generalize these ideas to something which has nothing to do with sequences, so it doesn't look like a language to start with, but just the ability to perceive a shape, perceive a quadrilateral shape. So let me test you again. Suppose you are a young child and you see this for the first time, and your only task is to touch the shape which is different. Did you spot it? All right, very easy, right? Let's try another. Which shape is different? Maybe a little bit harder. And how about this one? Which shape is different? Very hard, right? Well, this is the whole point. So we tested all of these shapes, which you can see on the screen right now. And believe it or not, there is the same amount of change in each of these shapes that I showed you before. We just display one point displaced in a different location. Can be one of these 4 locations here. But we always displace the dot by the same amount. So in a certain sense, on the screen itself, it should not be more difficult to detect this displacement. And that's what we ask our subject. Can you pick the outlier? It's this intruder shape. But you can see that some shapes are very regular, like the rectangle or the square. They have right angles, equal sides, equal angles, and we progressively remove all of these properties until we get to the most irregular shape, which has no geometrical property that is special. And this has been our finding. There is again a huge effect of regularity. Just like for sequences or for music, things that are regular are much, much easier to pick up. So it's very, very easy to pick up an outlier among squares or rectangles. It's much, much more difficult to pick up outliers among irregular shapes. And you see this sort of very continuous regularity effect here. And we found it also when we reverse the role of the deviant and of the standard shape. And you can see in this slide, we claim that this is a human universal because we find it in all sorts of experiments. We don't have to present the whole shape. We can just present its corners in a sequence format. And so this is bridging between the first part of my talk where I was talking about sequences versus this part where I'm talking just about seeing the shape on the screen. It really seems to be the same sort of regularity. We find it in preschoolers here. It's not as spectacular, but you see that the square and the rectangle are there. And even within those other shapes, there's still a regularity effect. We also find it if we go test people in Namibia who don't have formal geometry, don't have formal education, whose housing and so on does not have very strong regular shapes, but they still have this notion of a geometrical shape. So this is a very good test of the sense of geometry in humans. You see, it's a huge effect, by the way. It's very easy, almost 0% errors here, but all the way to 40% or 45% errors for the irregular shape. So it's a huge effect. And this allows us to ask, is there a sense of geometry in non-human primates again? Could we have exactly the same test in non-human primates? Would they show also a sense of geometry, or is this really about a language that allows us to combine properties to perceive a square as a set of four sides that are equal and four equal angles? So we decided to test that, and we are very lucky to collaborate with Joël Fagot, a colleague in the south of France who has a colony of baboons. And this is the colony of baboons, and it's really an extraordinary place because you see the baboons are essentially free roaming in a large area, but you see this booth at any time, 24 hours a day. Any monkey can enter this booth, and they will find a little computer waiting for them with a touch screen. The computer will recognize which baboon is entering, and they will essentially be able to play video games whenever they like. And some baboons actually like to enter at 2 in the night when the others are quiet and do their little video gaming. It's very addictive for them. So what's beautiful about this setup is that you can train monkeys in a pretty natural setting with thousands of trials. They typically get 1,000 trials per day, which is necessary to train these animals, give them a little education, if you will. Matthias Sable-Meyer, for his PhD with Joël Fagot and myself, did this in baboon. He trained them to do the intruder task. And he trained them, of course, initially without geometry, just with this sort of pictures. Pick the intruder. Very simple. The baboons could do that. Then he trained them with all of these shapes here. One is the intruder, the other is the standard shape. So there's 5 of this and maybe 1 deviant like this. And for most of these pairs, the baboons were excellent. They understood the intruder task. And we could also show that they understood the intruder task because we could generalize, they could generalize to these novel shapes. They could pick up, for instance, W in the middle of B's. Okay. Or color yellow in the middle of color blue, something like that. Once we were sure that they understood this intruder task, we asked, could they do the geometry task? And this is the result. On top, you have the humans. I'm reminding you of this huge effect. Squares and rectangles, very easy. Irregular, very hard. There is absolutely no such effect in the baboons. They could not care less whether it's a square or rectangle or irregular. You see, they do better than chance. Chance would be a little bit here. So this is the number of errors. They do a lot of errors. But chance would be 1 in 6 or 5 errors out of 6. And they do a bit better than that. And they also improve. So we are talking about thousands of trials here where they get trained, they get feedback, they get a reward, and they do improve. And they get to about 50% correct, which is much better than chance. So they don't do randomly, but they have no regularity effect whatsoever. They don't seem to make much of a difference between the square and the irregular shapes here. They don't pick up that this one is regular, and you can use the regularity to decide whether there is an intruder or not. So very, very different from humans. And maybe this is a little bit complicated, but I'll try to explain in a simple manner. The baboons did not behave randomly. And we found that we could explain the baboon's behavior, as you can see from this regression here, by what is called a convolutional neural network, an artificial intelligence model of what happens in their visual cortex. We all have the same visual cortex, roughly speaking, among non-human and human primates, and it can be modeled by a series of stages of processing information. That's how we recognize faces, for instance, or objects. So we just fed the shapes through the same network that's been found to be a good model of the visual cortex of non-human and human primates for recognizing faces and objects. And essentially, we feed each of these shapes as if it was a face, and we ask which is the most different, according to this network. This was an excellent predictor of the baboons. So the baboons essentially behaved as if these shapes were objects or faces. But the key point is that humans were different. In order to capture the human behavior, once again, we had to postulate a symbolic model, a sort of symbolic language where we list the properties, we list the number of right angles, the number of equal sides, equal angles, and so on. And when we list all of these properties, we can explain why humans find it easier to process squares compared to irregular shapes. And I hope you can see on the left here, all of the baboons have similar responses, and all of the humans have similar responses. And the humans are similar to the symbolic model, the baboons are similar to the neural network model. So our conclusion here is that there are two strategies for this task. You can just open your eyes, treat the shape as you would an object or a face or a scene, and this is what the baboons do. But only the humans seem to be able to do something else. You can look at the square and decide, oh, there is something logical here. There's a structure. The structure is that the sides are equal and the angles are equal. And there's 4 of them. And this is something that only humans do. And if you notice now the himbas and the preschoolers, the uneducated people, they have a mixture of the two strategies. They seem to be using a little bit of both. But crucially, unlike any of the baboons, they are using the symbolic model on some of the trials, on some of the shapes, at least. So they have the beginning of an understanding that the shapes are regular when they are squares and rectangles, just like we find in the Lascaux cave. So we are playing a lot with these ideas now. There is something very interesting here. It's a challenge to AI, right? Even the best AI networks, we tested a lot of these AI networks, they match the baboons, but they don't match the humans. And this is a very interesting thing. There is a lot of competition on the internet to find the most silly errors that these convolutional neural networks make. I think at NYU in particular, many of you are aware that there is a strong critique of these artificial neural networks. Maybe they capture a little bit what we do with faces, but they don't capture very well at all what we do with geometry or with symbols. And this is a great example. I hope you've recognized what this is, right? This is the door of a fridge with eggs. This is a relatively unfamiliar image, but no ambiguity. This was classified by an artificial neural network, and a very good one, as 99% confident that these are ping pong balls, right? Very silly error, but what's the root of the error? The texture may be one of ping pong balls, but the shape is completely wrong. And the network, just like the baboons, does not seem to care whether it's a perfect sphere, like a ping pong ball, or whether it's an egg shape. I'm using this as a funny example, but there's a lot of research showing that this notion of a language of geometry is not well captured by current artificial intelligence. We really need a sort of combinatorial symbolic system, which currently is a little bit hard to model with current artificial neural networks. We are also scanning subjects with these geometrical shapes, and I'm showing this also for Molly, who is excited by the latest results. We find that compared to all sorts of other displays, such as faces or objects or houses, which typically activate the visual ventral pathway of the brain. So you can see this is the bottom of the brain here, and on both sides, you have these visual areas that care about these sort of shapes. Well, geometrical shapes escape some of these network, and on the contrary, they again activate very strongly the intraparietal sulcus. You can see in red here in the right hemisphere of adults, and a little bit on the left, and also even in 6-year-olds. So we believe that once again, this is evidence that there is a sort of mental mathematical network that encodes number as well as geometrical shapes. Just to give you an idea of where we are going with this, quadrilaterals are one thing, but we really would like to explain the universal presence of shapes, which are not just restricted to quadrilateral like in Lascaux, but they also involve lines of dots, spirals, connections between these objects. For instance, you can find a square of circles. So we've been designing, and this is a very, very recent publication, it's just out now, it's no longer in revision. We found that we can propose a very simple language that accounts for all of these shapes that humans have been producing. The language has number, the language has a sense of geometry, it can move and turn and trace, a little bit like the logo language. And it has control structures to repeat, to concatenate, or to call subprograms. And with this extremely simple set of primitives, we can account for all sorts of shapes that have been attested across cultures. We can order them. So we claim that this is the simplest possible concept for humans, the straight line. Circle comes next, spiral is just next, or dotted lines. And then if you go down this list, you can see many of these shapes that are tested among human cultures, but less and less likely to be observed in one particular culture because they are more and more complex. This language allows us to explain why some cultures focus on some shapes, for instance, square shapes here that we've called a little bit exaggeratingly the Greek style of culture, and other cultures may focus on curved shapes, but both of these types of shapes can be obtained by our language. And it's easy to see how the network could become biased to produce a grammar with more of the left side shapes or more of the right side shapes. So we have a notion both of a universal language, but a language which creates such an explosion of possibilities that each culture has to specialize, cannot explore the whole set of possibilities. And this may explain why there is variability across cultures as well as universals in human cognition for geometry. So I think I'll come to my conclusions. It's been a long talk already, but just to summarize. First of all, I mean, we are primates. We inherit from our evolution a lot of basic fundamental concepts of number and space, but we have something more. And I hope I convince you that there are some sharp differences. We possess a capacity for symbolic thought. This means that we are able to discretize the concepts of number, of space, and we are able to combine them together. And this is what I mean by a mental language of geometry. We have thoughts that are combinatorial in nature that no other animal, if I am right, is able to have. No other animal is able to have the concept of a square. We have the concept of a square because we are able to formulate thoughts such as a shape with 4 sides that are equal and 4 angles that are equal. And this language allows us to discretize the concepts, to have very precise notions of true or false, to assign symbols that compose, and therefore to create a whole pyramid of learning mathematics, all the way to very high-level concepts. The view that I'm proposing here can explain a number of interesting things. First, it can explain why we all consider the same expressions as simple. We have the same language. All members of the human species have the same inner language of thought. And this may explain why there is so much convergence in mathematics. We all agree about the truth of mathematics by and large for, I would say, 99.99% of mathematical concepts. And there's a lot of cross-cultural convergence. For instance, this is the so-called Pascal triangle, but it's been found quite independently by Chinese mathematicians. This is because this is a very simple structure that we can single out by using the same language. The second thing is that the space of possible concepts in this view is exponentially large. So the space of mathematics is enormous and we keep exploring it. We can generate infinitely many concepts. And this may explain why there is suddenly, with the emergence of humans on Earth, an extraordinary expansion of representational abilities. Language is exponential. It allows us to have an exponential number of concepts. Some of these concepts are crazy. So by making this so-called infinite use of finite means, we can create chimeras. There's nothing simpler. And I think all human cultures have this sort of combinatorial concepts that are crazy. Nobody has ever seen an animal which is a mixture of a lion and a deer. Nobody has seen a snake with 7 heads. But I just gave you the formula for it. It's a very simple expression. If you have language, you can combine concepts and conceive of a snake with 7 heads. And this is a nice poster that I like to use. It's from a demonstration against Trump, maybe in New York, I think. It shows you alternative facts are imaginary, of course. But you see the square root of -1 here. This is one of the basic concepts of mathematics. How could we conceive of the square root of -1? It's bizarre. It's a very strange concept. And normally you could not take the square root of a negative number. But as an expression, in the language of thought is very simple. It's just a combination of a few symbols. And we found that this combination, maybe unlike the idea of the snake with 7 heads, was actually very useful in mathematics. So the human has this capacity to project an extraordinary number of concepts, and some of them in mathematics are found to be useful, and these are the ones that we keep. Square root of -1 is one of them. Of course, there are many other concepts that we can think of, including religious concepts. And I just want to conclude by saying that this sort of view of the human cultural explosion, first of all, may bridge between human biology and human culture, but also may explain why there is a diversity of cultures. The space is so large that we cannot exploit all of these possible concepts. And maybe language and culture act as catalysts that bring together a specific set of concepts and help children focus their attention and learning resources on these constructs that are deemed relevant in a given culture. And this is what we do, I think, when we train ourselves to become mathematicians. We learn that there are specific combinations of our existing concepts that are useful. Square is very useful. Square root of -1 is a useful concept. And we focus on these. And of course, each mathematician ultimately focuses on a limited number of these constructions. With that, I would like to close. I will show you this joke from the New Yorker from, I think, a few years ago, where you see this prehistoric man looking at animals and saying, we have to record this or no one's going to believe us. I think there's something very true about this. We see the world, we project onto the world a geometrical vision. And that's why we have these beautiful cave paintings that I started with in the Lascaux cave. We impose on the world, thanks to the structure of our brain, an abstraction, a language of geometry.